CEO hears a simple elderly woman speak 9 languages. What he does next leaves the whole office stunned. Margaret Walsh sat alone on a bench outside the towering glass headquarters of Pinnacle Innovation in downtown Chicago. At 73, with her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a modest dress that had seen better days, she clutched a well-worn leather portfolio. The autumn wind swept through the urban canyon, scattering golden leaves across the plaza as executives in tailored suits rushed past, none sparing her a glance. Her arthritic fingers tightened nervously around the portfolio containing decades of memories and achievements, now condensed into a single-page resume that omitted most of her life's work. Inside the 40-story building, CEO Daniel Harrington reviewed quarterly reports in his corner office. At 45, his success was evident in everything from his custom suit to the panoramic view of Lake Michigan, framed magazine covers featuring his rise from software developer to industry titan lined one wall. The intercom buzzed, "Mr. Harrington, your 10 a.m. interview is here." Daniel sighed, remembering the custodial position interview his HR director had insisted he conduct personally, part of their new Leadership Connection initiative. He straightened his silk tie and nodded to his assistant as Margaret was escorted in, her footsteps hesitant on the polished marble floor. "Mrs. Walsh, please have a seat," Daniel said, barely looking up from his papers. "Your application says you're interested in our evening custodial position." "Yes, sir," Margaret replied softly, her hands trembling slightly as she settled into the leather chair. "I've been looking for work since my husband passed. Our savings, well, they don't stretch as far as we'd hoped. The medical bills took most of what we had." Daniel nodded mechanically, scanning her application with practiced efficiency. His phone rang with an international call he'd been expecting. "Excuse me, I need to take this," he answered, immediately confronted with a frustrated voice speaking rapid Mandarin. Before his translator could join the call, Margaret spoke up. "He's saying the shipment was delayed at customs because of paperwork errors," she said in perfect English. "The forms were filed under the wrong category. He's quite concerned about meeting his production deadlines." Daniel stared at her, stunned. He hesitantly put the call on speaker. Margaret leaned forward and addressed the caller in flawless Mandarin, her voice suddenly confident and clear, all traces of timidity vanishing. The man on the other end sounded relieved, responding enthusiastically. After a brief exchange, Margaret turned to Daniel. "He says if you resend the documentation properly classified, they can clear it tomorrow. He appreciates your understanding and mentions this is his 3rd attempt to reach someone who comprehends the urgency." Daniel thanked the caller and hung up, looking at Margaret with newfound curiosity. "You speak Mandarin?" "Yes," she replied modestly, hands returning to her lap. "And Cantonese? I lived in Hong Kong for several years in my 20s. The markets there taught me more than any classroom could." The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Daniel's office as he sat across from Margaret, now genuinely interested in her story. Outside, the Chicago skyline stretched toward a brilliant blue sky, the bustle of the city creating a distant hum below. Steam rose from fresh coffee his assistant had brought for them both, served in fine porcelain for him and in the same cup for Margaret, a small gesture of growing respect. "So you were a diplomatic attaché?" Daniel asked, leaning forward, abandoning the quarterly reports that had seemed so urgent an hour earlier. Margaret nodded, her eyes brightening with memories. "For nearly 30 years, my husband was a cultural officer. We were stationed in Brussels, Seoul, Buenos Aires, Cairo, and several other postings. Those were different times. I wasn't just a wife. I was considered part of the diplomatic package. I handled cultural affairs, translated during sensitive negotiations, helped organize events that became foundations for international agreements." Daniel's phone rang again, a call from their German partners. Without thinking, he put it on speaker. The German executive launched into a heated complaint about contract terms, his accent thickening with frustration. Margaret listened attentively, her posture shifting subtly. She replied in perfect German, her tone respectful but firm, adding idiomatic expressions that caused the German executive to chuckle unexpectedly. His demeanor immediately changed, becoming almost apologetic. After the call, Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "That's 3 languages I've heard you speak fluently in the span of an hour. How many do you know?" Margaret counted on her fingers, a habit from teaching children in various countries. English, Mandarin, Cantonese, German, French, Spanish, Arabic, Korean, and enough Russian to get by. 9, I suppose. Though my Russian is rather rusty now. It's been years since I've had the opportunity to use it regularly. "And you're applying for a custodial position?" Daniel asked, unable to hide his surprise, glancing down at the simple application form that listed only her high school education, omitting entirely her international experience. Margaret's expression clouded, fine lines deepening around her eyes. "At my age, Mr. Harrington, people see gray hair and assume obsolescence. I applied for 14 positions more aligned with my experience. None called back. 2 specifically mentioned seeking digital natives and fresh perspectives. After a while, you stop setting yourself up for rejection." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Daniel glanced at the organizational chart on his wall, an idea forming in his mind as he thought about the recent string of misunderstandings with international clients. "Our International Relations Department has been struggling with cultural miscommunications," he said thoughtfully. "We've hired top graduates, but they lack real-world experience. Last month, we nearly lost a Japanese client because someone scheduled dinner too early and presented a gift with the wrong hand." Margaret smiled faintly. "Book learning is valuable, but there's no substitute for sitting across from someone, breaking bread, and understanding what truly matters to them. Those nuances aren't in textbook. The way a Thai businessman will never directly say no, how an Argentine expects personal conversation before business, how silence functions differently in Japanese negotiation." Rain pattered against the windows of the conference room where 12 executives sat around a mahogany table, skepticism evident on their faces. Water streaked down the glass, mirroring the cold reception inside. Daniel stood at the head of the table, with Margaret seated quietly beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple blue blazer, the best she could manage on short notice, borrowed from a neighbor. "You want to create a new position for someone with no corporate experience." The CFO, Victoria Chen, didn't attempt to hide her disapproval, tapping her manicured nails against her tablet. "In this economic climate, with our shareholders demanding cost reductions, I understand your concerns," Daniel replied, maintaining his composure despite the tension in the room. "But Mrs. Walsh brings something invaluable: decades of cross-cultural negotiation experience and fluency in 9 languages. Experience we've been trying to cultivate without success." "We have translators," said James Peterson, the head of sales, leaning back in his chair with arms crossed, "and younger candidates with international business degrees from top universities. People who understand modern business practices and technology." Margaret sat silently, feeling the weight of their judgment. She'd experienced this before, being underestimated, overlooked because of her age, her unassuming appearance. Under the table, her hands trembled slightly, but her face remained composed, dignity intact despite the dismissive glances. "Oh, perhaps a demonstration," Daniel suggested. He turned to Margaret. "Would you mind?" She nodded, standing slowly. The executives watched with thinly veiled impatience as she moved to the center of the room, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disinterest. Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm intensified. "Your Saudi client is arriving tomorrow," Margaret began, addressing James directly. You've arranged a dinner meeting at Smith & Walensky. But did you know that in Saudi business culture, diving straight into negotiations is considered rude, and that serving alcohol prominently might make him uncomfortable, even if he doesn't say so? James blinked in surprise, his posture shifting. I was planning to discuss the contract over appetizer, and I specifically chose that restaurant for their wine selection. Margaret smiled gently. Psych. Spend the first meeting building rapport. Ask about his family, but not his wife specifically. That would be inappropriate. Express admiration for Saudi heritage. The actual business can wait until the second meeting, and perhaps consider the palm instead. Excellent steaks, but you can keep the alcohol less central to the meal. She turned to Victoria. And your presentation to the Japanese investors. I noticed you scheduled it for Tuesday at 4 p.m. Victoria nodded. That's right. They requested afternoon. In Japanese business culture, important meetings are held in the morning when minds are freshest. It shows respect. A late afternoon meeting suggests it's not a priority. They would never correct you directly. Saving face is paramount, but it would be noticed. And have you prepared multiple copies of your materials in individual folders? Group handouts would be considered thoughtless. One by one, Margaret addressed each executive first, offering specific cultural insights relevant to their current international project. She correctly identified the Korean delegation's discomfort with direct contract negotiations, explained why the Brazilian partner always arrived late by American standards, and suggested serving tea rather than coffee to the Chinese investors. Small details with outsized impact. The room grew quiet, skepticism gradually replaced by attentive interest. Snow fell gently outside the windows of Pinnacle Innovations, blanketing Chicago in pristine white. The Michigan Avenue lights twinkled through the flurries, creating a magical urban landscape. Inside, the office buzzed with activity as employees prepared for the holiday party. Red and green decorations adorned cubicles, and the aroma of spiced cider filled the air. In the 3 months since Margaret had joined the company as Director of Cultural Intelligence, the atmosphere of the International Relations Department had transformed. Daniel watched from across the room as Margaret sat with the young international team, sharing stories about negotiating during Ramadan in Morocco. Her eyes crinkled with laughter as she described a cultural misunderstanding involving shoes and an important sheikh. The younger employees leaned in, captivated, their initial resistance to her guidance now replaced with genuine respect. It's remarkable what she's accomplished, said Victoria, now one of Margaret's strongest advocates, sipping mulled wine from a company mug. The sole deal alone justified her salary for the year, $3 million in new business that we nearly lost before she corrected our approach. Daniel nodded, watching snowflakes swirl outside. The client specifically mentioned her understanding of Korean familial respect concepts, said it was the first time he felt an American company truly understood his priorities. Did you know she lived there for 4 years in the 80s? Not just the clients, Victoria added, her expression softening. Have you noticed how the department communicates better internally now? Those young MBAs were brilliant individually, but couldn't collaborate effectively. Too competitive, too focused on individual advancement. Now they're a team. She somehow manages to offer wisdom without condescension. Across the room, Margaret was demonstrating proper business card exchange protocol with Japan to a new hire, presenting with both hands, taking time to read before putting it away, never writing on it. Her movements were precise, respectful, a small detail that could make or break a first impression. A cluster of employees watched attentively, some taking notes. She mentioned she's starting a mentorship program, Daniel said, straightening his festive tie, pairing our younger staff with senior executives to build institutional knowledge transfer, creating conversation spaces where neither age group feels judged. Victoria smiled, her earlier skepticism long forgotten. Smart. Breaks down the age silos we've developed, She hesitated, watching Margaret patiently answer questions. "I was wrong about her, you know. I thought her age was a liability. I saw her resume with no corporate experience and made assumptions. Most of us did," Daniel admitted, "including her, I think. When she first came in for that custodial position interview, she seemed diminished somehow, like someone who had accepted society's message that she no longer had value to offer. She mentioned yesterday that she'd stopped including her diplomatic experience on applications because interviewers seemed intimidated or dismissive. They watched as Margaret moved among the staff, a natural teacher sharing wisdom accumulated over decades. Her confidence had blossomed, her posture now straight and proud, her voice carrying easily across the room. She wore a simple but elegant red sweater, purchased with her first paycheck. She'd confided to Daniel earlier. Spring brought new energy to Chicago, trees budding along Michigan Avenue as people emerged from winter hibernation. The riverside cafes reopened their patios, and downtown hummed with renewed vigor after months of cold. At Pinnacle Innovations, Margaret stood before the board of directors in the top-floor conference room, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows as she presented the results of her first 6 months. International client retention has increased 22%, she explained, indicating the graph on the screen behind her, her laser pointer steady. Cultural misunderstandings during negotiations have decreased by 35%. And perhaps most significantly, we've reduced translation costs by 60% by building internal language capacity through our Lunch and Learn language program. The board members nodded appreciatively, several taking notes. Margaret had become something of a legend within the company, the elderly custodial applicant who had transformed their international business strategy. Her simple navy dress conveyed professionalism without ostentation, a pearl necklace her only adornment. "The numbers are impressive," said the board chairman, removing his glasses. "But I'm equally interested in the qualitative changes. I keep hearing about something called Margaret's Method. My granddaughter just started in marketing and mentioned it in our family dinner." Margaret smiled, a touch of color rising in her cheeks. "Nothing so formal. I simply encourage our team to approach each international relationship with cultural humility, to listen before speaking, to ask rather than assume, to recognize that our way isn't the only way, and sometimes not even the best way. The young people have been remarkably receptive. They're natural learners when given permission to be curious rather than authoritative." "It seems to be working," the chairman observed. "We've received glowing feedback from partners in Asia particularly. The Singapore office reported last week that they've never felt so connected to headquarters." "I've been meaning to ask," Daniel said, closing the door for privacy. "What made you apply for the custodial position that day? With your background, surely there were other options." Margaret paused, considering her answer carefully, looking out at the spring leaves emerging on the trees below. "Our pride can only sustain you so long against rejection," she said finally. "After dozens of unanswered applications, I decided any honest work was better than feeling useless. My husband had been gone 18 months. The silence in our apartment was deafening. I needed purpose, even if it meant cleaning offices at night, while the real business happened during the day. Though sometimes I wonder about all the other Margarets out there, people with valuable experience and knowledge, overlooked because they don't fit the expected profile. For every one of me who happens to be in the right place at the right time, how many others are discarded? That banker with 40 years of experience now bagging groceries, the retired teacher driving for Uber, the engineer who can't get interviews because his graduation date gives away his age. We're here to celebrate not just Margaret Walsh's extraordinary contributions to our company, but also the launch of what we believe will transform corporate America's approach to experienced talent. Today, we're officially launching the Margaret Walsh Initiative, Daniel announced, his voice carrying through the atrium. Chiku, a program dedicated to identifying and recruiting experienced professionals who have been overlooked by traditional hiring practices. We're committing $10 million over 5 years to create opportunities, mentorship programs, and training that bridges generational divides in the workplace. When I walked into this building a year ago, she said, her voice steady, I had convinced myself that my useful years were behind me. I'd internalized the message that society often sends to older workers, that we're obsolete, that our knowledge is outdated, that we can't adapt or learn new ways. I'd begun to believe that the only value I could offer was performing tasks others deemed beneath them. What I've learned this year is that wisdom and experience aren't liabilities. They're competitive advantages. They can't be downloaded or acquired overnight. They can't be taught in even the most prestigious universities. They must be lived. Every gray hair represents a lesson learned, a challenge overcome, a relationship built. This initiative isn't about charity, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. It's about recognizing untapped talent and the tremendous value of diverse perspectives, including age diversity. It's about building teams that span generations, combining the innovation of youth with the wisdom of experience. It's about creating workplaces where no one feels that their expiration date has passed simply because of a number. Our greatest resource has always been human potential, Margaret concluded, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. And that potential doesn't diminish with age. It transforms, deepens, and if we're wise enough to recognize it, continues to enrich our lives and our work in ways we never imagined possible. Today marks not just a new chapter for this company, but hopefully the beginning of a wider recognition that talent doesn't have an expiration date, and wisdom is too valuable to waste.